Walk through a dying American town and you notice the silence. What you don't notice is what the silence replaced. Synagogues, Hebrew schools, and Yiddish spoken on street corners in places like Indiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Jewish immigrants came to these unlikely towns, built something complete and lasting, and then left, so thoroughly that their former homes now sell for less than a used car. 12 of those towns still exist. Almost no one knows what they once were. Let us begin. Number 12. Johnstown sits in Cambria County in western Pennsylvania, tucked into a narrow river valley where the Conemaugh River bends south toward the Allegheny Mountains. It was built on coal and steel. At its peak in the early 20th century, Johnstown was home to over 80,000 people. Today, fewer than 18,000 remain. On certain streets in the lower wards, three-bedroom houses list for $7,900. In the 1920s, the Jewish population of Johnstown reached approximately 3,000 residents. They concentrated in the Kernville neighborhood and along the slopes of Upper Westmont. The community built two synagogues. Beth Zion on Vine Street served the more established German Jewish families. Ohev Tzedek served the Eastern European arrivals who came later and in larger numbers. The Young Men's Hebrew Association on Walnut Street became the social heart of Jewish Johnstown for 4 decades. There were Hebrew schools, a Jewish welfare society, and a network of mutual aid organizations that sustained families through the Depression years. Then came the flood of 1936, which killed 25 people and caused damage that the city spent a decade recovering from. Then came the slow death of steel. The mills that had called these families to western Pennsylvania began closing through the 1960s and 70s. Jewish families followed the jobs to Pittsburgh, to Philadelphia, to other cities with futures. By 2000, fewer than 200 Jewish residents remained in Johnstown. Beth Zion was demolished. The YMHA building sat derelict for years. Number 11. Cairo sits at the southernmost tip of Illinois, at the exact point where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi. For a brief period in the 19th century, it seemed destined to become one of the great cities of the American interior. Mark Twain wrote about it. Charles Dickens wrote about it. Population reached over 15,000 in the years after the Civil War. Today, fewer than 1,800 people live there. A brick house on Walnut Street recently sold at auction for $950. Jewish merchants arrived in Cairo in the 1850s, drawn by the river trade and the promise of a commercial hub at the confluence of two of the continent's greatest waterways. By the 1880s, they had established themselves firmly along 8th Street, the commercial spine of the town. Congregation Temple B'nai Israel was founded in 1878. Jewish families operated dry goods stores, hardware merchants, and several of Cairo's most important banking concerns. For nearly a century, the Jewish presence on 8th Street was continuous and visible. The unraveling came slowly and then all at once. Cairo's racial divisions, never resolved after the Civil War, erupted in sustained violence during the 1960s. Bombings, sniper fire, and an economic boycott organized by the black community against white-owned businesses tore the commercial district apart. White families, including the Jewish families who had traded on 8th Street for generations, left through the late 60s and early 70s. Temple B'nai Israel held its last service in 1971. The building still stands on Washington Avenue. Its brickwork is intact. The Star of David above the entrance is still visible. Inside, there is nothing. Number 10. Newburgh sits on the west bank of the Hudson River in Orange County, New York, roughly 60 miles north of Manhattan. In the 19th century, it was a prosperous river town, a center of trade and manufacturing, home to 40,000 people at its height. Today, the population is around 28,000, but the city's poverty rate is among the highest in New York State. In the historic district along Grand Street and Liberty Street, individual properties have listed for $11,000. The Jewish community of Newburgh was among the oldest in the Hudson Valley. Congregation Temple Beth Jacob and later Agudas Israel were established to serve the growing Jewish community in Newburgh. By the 1930s and 40s, several hundred Jewish families lived and worked in Newburgh, concentrated around Broadway and Liberty Street. There was a Jewish community center, a Hebrew school, and a full social infrastructure of organizations and clubs. The congregation met in a Romanesque revival building on Grand Street that had been constructed in 1888 and was considered one of the finest synagogue buildings in the region. Urban renewal programs in the 1960s demolished whole blocks of the old commercial district. Manufacturing left the city. Jewish families relocated to the suburbs of Orange County, to Middletown and Monroe and Goshen. The congregation followed them, eventually leaving the Grand Street building entirely. The building was sold, converted, and later fell into disrepair. The neighborhood around it became one of the poorest in the state. A detached house on Dubois Street recently listed for $11,000. Number 9. Homestead is a borough on the Monongahela River, 5 miles south of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County. It was the site of the Carnegie Steel Company's most productive mill. Population once reached over 20,000. Today, fewer than 3,000 people live in Homestead. A brick row house on Ann Street recently listed for $4,500. Jewish immigrants arrived in Homestead in the 1880s and 90s, fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland and following the steel industry inland from the port cities of the East Coast. By 1920, the Jewish population of Homestead numbered approximately 2,000. They settled on West Street and Ann Street and built 2 synagogues, a Jewish mutual aid society, and a Hebrew school. For 30 years, Jewish-owned shops lined 8th Avenue, the main commercial street of the borough. The Homestead Strike of 1892 is among the most famous labor disputes in American history. Carnegie's plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, locked out the steelworkers and called in Pinkerton agents. The confrontation left 10 men dead. Jewish workers stood on both sides of that line, as laborers fighting for their wages and as merchants trying to keep their shops open through the chaos. The community survived that crisis. It survived the Depression. It did not survive the steel collapse of the 1970s and 80s. By the time the last Jewish congregation in Homestead closed, there were almost no Jewish residents left to notice. Number 8. Newport, Kentucky sits on the south bank of the Ohio River, directly across from Cincinnati. For much of the 20th century, Newport was known as the Sin City of the South, a place of legal gambling, nightclubs, and brothels that operated openly under the protection of a corrupt local government. Population reached 30,000 at its height. Today, the city counts fewer than 15,000 residents. A 2-bedroom house on Orchard Street recently listed for $7,000. Jewish merchants were established in Newport from the 1880s onward. They traded along York Street and Monmouth Street, running drapery shops, jewelry stores, and wholesale businesses. Congregation. Adath Israel was founded in Newport in 1882 and served several hundred families for nearly a century. The community's identity was closely tied to the much larger Jewish world across the river in Cincinnati. Newport's Jews crossed the bridge regularly for the bigger Hebrew schools, the larger synagogues, and the social life that Cincinnati offered. The dismantling of Newport's vice economy began in the 1960s, when state and federal authorities finally moved against the gambling operations that had sustained the city for decades. The clubs closed. The income they generated disappeared. The businesses that had depended on the foot traffic of gamblers and tourists collapsed with them. Jewish families who had already been looking toward the Cincinnati suburbs made their final decisions. Congregation Adath, Israel closed in the 1970s. The building was demolished. Number 7. Braddock is a borough in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, on the Monongahela River, 7 miles east of Pittsburgh. It was here that Andrew Carnegie built his first steel mill in 1875. The Carnegie Library of Braddock, opened in 1888, was the first Carnegie Library in the world. Population peaked at over 20,000. Today, fewer than 2,000 people live in Braddock. On Bell Avenue and Talbot Avenue, houses have sold at auction for $1,800. Eastern European Jewish immigrants reached Braddock in the 1880s and 90s, settling near the mill and building quickly. By 1920, the Jewish population had grown to approximately 2,500. The Talmud Torah congregation on Braddock Avenue was the community's anchor. There was a Young Men's Hebrew Association, a Jewish library on the main street, and a row of Jewish-owned businesses along Braddock Avenue that served the workers of Carnegie's Mill for 5 decades. The community produced doctors, lawyers, and merchants who remained connected to Braddock long after they had moved to the suburbs. Braddock's collapse became a national story in the 2000s when John Fetterman, who later became a United States Senator, arrived as mayor and spent a decade attempting to reverse the decline. Journalists and photographers documented the ruins exhaustively. The Talmud Torah building was gone before Fetterman arrived. The Jewish businesses on Braddock Avenue had been gone for 30 years. A house on Bell Avenue sold at auction for $1,800 in a recent year. Number 6. Gary, Indiana was created in 1906 by the United States Steel Corporation. The company purchased 9,000 acres of sand dunes and marshland on the southern shore of Lake Michigan and built a city around a single purpose. The city was named after Elbert Henry Gary, the corporation's chairman. Population reached 178,000 by 1960. Today, fewer than 65,000 people remain. In some zip codes in Gary, the median home value falls below $15,000. Individual properties have sold at auction for under $2,000. The Jewish community of Gary grew alongside the steel industry through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. By the mid-20th century, several thousand Jewish residents lived in Gary, concentrated in the Miller Beach neighborhood on the eastern side of the city and along Broadway in the commercial center. Congregation Beth David, established in 1913, was the principal synagogue. There were Hebrew schools, a Jewish community center, and a chapter of B'nai B'rith that served hundreds of families. Jewish pharmacists, grocers, and clothing merchants operated along Broadway and Fifth Avenue for 4 decades. The United States Steel Corporation began contracting its Gary operations in the 1970s. Employment at the mill dropped from 30,000 workers to fewer than 6,000 over the following 2 decades. The city lost its reason for existing. White flight accelerated through the 1970s and 80s. Violent crime rose as the economic base collapsed. Jewish families left with the broader middle-class exodus. The Beth David Synagogue was abandoned and eventually demolished. A brick bungalow on Adams Street recently listed for $3,500. Number 5. Utica is a city in Oneida County in central New York State, roughly 90 miles northwest of Albany. It grew as a center of textile manufacturing and as a port on the Erie Canal. Population reached over 100,000 in the 1940s and 50s. Today, the city counts around 60,000 residents. In the Cornhill neighborhood and along East Utica's residential streets, houses list for $9,000. Utica's Jewish community had deep roots. German Jewish families arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, establishing the earliest congregations. Eastern European immigrants followed after 1900 and built the institutions that came to define Jewish Utica. By the 1940s, around 6,000 Jewish residents lived in the city. They supported Temple Beth El, which occupied a magnificent Moorish revival building on Genesee Street constructed in 1927. There was also Congregation Zvi Jacob, the Orthodox congregation Sons of Abraham on Steuben Street, a Jewish community center, Hebrew schools, and a full range of mutual aid societies. Jewish merchants operated along Bleecker Street and Genesee Street for 3 generations. The textile mills began leaving Utica in the 1950s. The manufacturing economy that had sustained the city for a century contracted steadily through the 1960s and 70s. Jewish families followed the professional opportunities to Albany, to Syracuse, and to the New York metropolitan area. By the 1990s, the Jewish population of Utica had fallen below 1,000. Temple Beth El, the Moorish revival building that had anchored Jewish life in the city since 1927, was sold to a church. The Sons of Abraham congregation closed. A house in the Cornhill neighborhood recently listed for $9,000. Number 4. Youngstown is a city in northeastern Ohio, in the Mahoning Valley near the Pennsylvania border. It was one of the great steel cities of 20th century America, a place where the mills along the river ran day and night for decades, and where a working man could earn a wage that sustained a family and a community. Population reached 170,000 in 1930. Today, fewer than 60,000 people live in Youngstown. In the Adora Park neighborhood and along certain streets in Briar Hill, houses list for $4,200. The Jewish community of Youngstown was substantial and deeply established. Eastern European immigrants arrived in the 1890s and early 1900s, settling first in the lower Briar Hill neighborhood near the mills, and then spreading outward as the community grew more prosperous. By 1950, the Jewish population of Youngstown stood at approximately 12,000. The community supported 8 synagogues. There was a Jewish community center on Gypsy Lane, 3 Hebrew schools, and a full infrastructure of organizations and institutions. September 19, 1977 is the date that Youngstown remembers as Black Monday. On that morning, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company announced the closure of its Campbell Works plant. 5,000 workers lost their jobs in a single day. Plant after plant closed through the late 70s and the 80s. The Mahoning Valley lost 60,000 manufacturing jobs within a decade. Jewish families had already been moving to the suburbs of Boardman and Poland and Canfield. After Black Monday, the movement became a flight. By 2000, fewer than 2,000 Jewish residents remained in Youngstown proper. The last downtown synagogue closed its doors. A house on Belle Vista Avenue in the Adora Park neighborhood recently listed for $4,200. Number 3. Trenton is the capital of New Jersey. It sits on the Delaware River, across the water from Pennsylvania, and its famous motto appears on the Lower Free Bridge in letters large enough to read from the water. Trenton makes, the world takes. Population reached 128,000 in 1950. Today, the city holds around 90,000 residents, but the poverty concentrated in certain neighborhoods is severe. On Lelore Street and Rose Street and Hamilton Avenue, houses list for $8,000. Trenton's Jewish community was once one of the largest and most active in New Jersey, surpassed only by Newark and the communities of the New York suburbs. At its peak in the 1940s and 50s, the Jewish population of Trenton stood at approximately 20,000. The community concentrated in the Chambersburg neighborhood and the 6th Ward. There were 11 synagogues at the height of Jewish Trenton. There was a Jewish community center, multiple Hebrew schools, and a network of organizations and social clubs that gave the community structure and continuity. Jewish merchants dominated South Broad Street's retail district for decades. Urban renewal in the 1960s destroyed the 6th Ward. Buildings were demolished. Families were displaced. The physical geography of Jewish Trenton was erased by municipal policy before economics had the chance to do it alone. Manufacturing left the city through the 1950s and 60s. Jewish families relocated to Lawrence Township, to Hamilton, to Princeton Junction, and the commuter suburbs of Mercer County. By the 1990s, the Jewish population of Trenton proper had fallen below 2,000. Several synagogue buildings were demolished. Others were sold and converted. The Jewish Community Center closed. A 2-story brick house on Lelore Street recently listed for $8,000. Number 2. Chester is the oldest city in Pennsylvania. William Penn landed here in 1682 and established the first capital of the Pennsylvania colony on this ground. The city sits in Delaware County on the Delaware River, 12 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Population peaked at 66,000 in 1950. Today, fewer than 30,000 people live in Chester. On Parker Street and Engle Street and Potter Street, houses have sold at auction for $800. Jewish families established themselves in Chester in the early 20th century. By the 1940s, several thousand Jewish residents lived in the city, concentrated in the 3rd and 8th Ward neighborhoods. The community supported 3 congregations, with the principal one being Sons of Israel, which occupied a substantial building and served hundreds of families at its peak. There was a Hebrew school, a network of social organizations, and a visible Jewish commercial presence along Edgemont Avenue and Market Street. The shipyards and manufacturing plants that had given Chester its economic purpose began closing in the 1950s. The city's tax base eroded steadily. Poverty concentrated. Crime rose. The Jewish community relocated to the suburbs of Springfield, of Media, of Upper Darby. By the 1970s, the movement was essentially complete. The Sons of Israel building was sold. The Hebrew school closed. Chester's school district, one of the most underfunded in Pennsylvania, was eventually placed under state receivership. In 2014, the city itself was placed under the oversight of a state-appointed receiver due to financial insolvency. A row house on Parker Street in Chester recently listed for $800. Number 1. East St. Louis sits in St. Clair County, Illinois, on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. The Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri is visible from its streets on a clear day. The city that watches it from across the water has gone almost entirely the other way. Population peaked at 82,000 in 1950. Today, fewer than 18,000 people remain. In certain zip codes in East St. Louis, houses have sold at auction for $500. One property on Bond Avenue recently recorded a sale price of $1. Few people in Britain and few people even in the United States know that East St. Louis once had a Jewish community. At its peak in the 1920s and 30s, the Jewish population numbered several thousand, concentrated along Collinsville Avenue in the commercial heart of the city. Congregation Agudas Achim was established in the early 20th century and served the community for many decades. There was a Young Men's Hebrew Association, a Hebrew school, and a network of social clubs and mutual aid societies. Jewish merchants were among the most prominent business people in East St. Louis for 5 decades, running dry goods stores and clothing shops and hardware merchants on Collinsville Avenue. But East St. Louis carries a history that no account of the city can avoid. In July of 1917, a mob of white residents attacked the black community of East St. Louis over the course of 2 days. Estimates of the dead range from 39 to as many as 250, depending on the source. Thousands of black residents were driven from their homes. The violence was witnessed and documented. The journalist Ida B. Wells investigated and reported on it. The NAACP sent W.E.B. Du Bois to document what had happened. The massacre of 1917 is one of the worst episodes of racial violence in American history. Jewish residents of East St. Louis lived through those days as neighbors and witnesses, as members of a community that had itself fled violence in Eastern Europe and arrived in a country where violence of a different kind was already underway. The Jewish community of East St. Louis dispersed through the 1950s and 60s as the industrial economy contracted and white flight stripped the city of its middle class. They relocated to University City and Clayton and the suburbs of St. Louis County across the river. Congregation B'nai El closed. The building was eventually demolished. East St. Louis lost its industrial base, then its population, then its government's ability to function. For years, the city could not pay its police officers. Schools were closed mid-year for lack of funds. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to remove the cost of maintaining them. Today, East St. Louis has more vacant lots than occupied buildings across wide stretches of its territory. A house on Collinsville Avenue, 1 block from where the Jewish merchants once traded, recently listed for $500. The Gateway Arch is still visible from that street on a clear day.